Spring. It's a season of rebirth. The world, frozen and gray, finally thaws. The sun feels warm on your skin for the first time in months. The air smells of damp earth and fresh blossoms. It's a time for new beginnings, for cleaning out the old, for finally getting back outside. But what if the melting snow doesn't just reveal green grass? What if the spring rains awaken things that should have stayed buried? The truth is, spring isn't just about life. It's also about what the death of winter leaves behind. The things that were covered, frozen, and forgotten are now exposed. And sometimes, they're waiting for you. Hello and welcome. Today, we're pushing aside the flowers and sunshine to look at the darkness that can bloom in the brightest season. We're diving into 3 allegedly true, deeply unsettling stories that all take place in the spring. These aren't tales of autumn ghosts or winter isolation. These are true spring horror stories, born from the thaw, the rain, and the unnerving feeling that you're not alone, even when the whole world seems to be coming back to life. So, get comfortable and let's begin. Our first story comes from a man named Mark, who in his late 20s decided to take a break from city life. He and his girlfriend, Sarah, rented a small, rustic cabin in rural Vermont for a year. Their dream was to experience all 4 seasons in the heart of nature. They loved the fall, tolerated the winter, but they were most excited for spring. Specifically, for the maple syrup season. The property they rented came with a few acres of woods, dotted with old maple trees. And deep in those woods, there was a dilapidated old sugar shack, a small cabin where syrup was once boiled. The landlord told them it hadn't been used in 50 years and to just stay away from it. Naturally, that made it an object of fascination. As the last of the heavy snow began to melt in late March, creating a landscape of mud and slush, Mark and Sarah decided to finally hike out to the old shack. The air was cold but carried the promise of warmth. The ground squelched under their boots. It was a perfect spring day. They found the shack listing to one side, its roof caved in. The door had long since rotted off its hinges. Inside, it was dark and smelled of rust and damp earth. A huge, ancient cast iron evaporator, where the sap would have been boiled, sat in the center of the room like a rusty altar. Old buckets and tools were scattered everywhere, half buried in decades of dirt and leaves. It was Sarah who found it. Tucked away in a dark corner, underneath a pile of rotted burlap sacks, was a wooden box. It wasn't a fancy box, just a simple crate, but it was nailed shut. Mark, ever the curious one, pried it open with a tire iron he found nearby. Inside, there wasn't treasure. There were dozens of small, handmade dolls. They were crudely fashioned from corn husks, twigs, and bits of stained cloth. But the most disturbing part was their faces. Each doll had a face made from a hardened, brownish-red substance. And on each face was a single, tiny, human tooth. A baby tooth. They were horrified. It felt like they'd stumbled upon some dark ritual site. They quickly nailed the box shut, shoved it back into the corner, and practically ran back to their cabin, the idyllic spring day now feeling sinister and cold. That night, the spring peepers, the little frogs whose chirping fills the night air, started their chorus. But mixed in with the chirping, Mark and Sarah both heard another sound. A faint, high-pitched giggle like that of a small child, coming from the direction of the woods. They tried to dismiss it as the wind or an animal. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. A week later, a late spring storm rolled in, with heavy rain and wind lashing against the cabin. Around midnight, the power went out. As they sat in the dark, listening to the storm, they heard a loud thump on their front porch. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. Lying on their welcome mat, soaking wet and covered in mud, was one of the corn husk dolls from the sugar shack. Its little twig arms were outstretched, and its single tooth seemed to glint in the flashlight beam. There were no footprints in the mud around the porch. The sugar shack was a good half-mile through dense, treacherous woods. There was no way a child could have run through that in a storm. There was no way anyone could have placed it there without leaving a trace. They were paralyzed with fear. They locked themselves in the bedroom until dawn. The moment the sun was up, they packed a single bag, got in their car, and drove away. They broke their lease, lost their deposit, and never looked back. Mark says that for years afterward, especially on damp spring nights, he could sometimes hear a faint, high-pitched giggle on the edge of his hearing. He believes that by opening that box, they disturbed something that was tied to the land, that awakened with the thaw, and that used the teeth of children to give itself a voice. This experience turned their dream of a peaceful life into one of the most scary outdoor stories imaginable, a permanent stain on what should have been a beautiful season. Story 2. The Murmuring Flood. We often associate spring with rain. April showers, May flowers, all of that. But sometimes, the rain doesn't stop. It swells rivers and creeks, turning them from gentle streams into raging monsters. Our second story is about what happens when the water rises and brings old secrets to the surface. This comes from a woman named Chloe, who grew up in a small town in the Ohio River Valley. Her childhood home was on a hill, safe from the river, but she had friends who lived down in the floodplain. Every few springs, they'd have to deal with minor flooding, water in the basement, a swamped backyard. It was a part of life. But the spring she turned 16 was different. The rain was relentless for 2 straight weeks. The river didn't just flood, it swallowed whole sections of the town. Houses that had stood for a century were inundated with murky brown water. When the floodwaters finally receded, they left behind a thick, stinking layer of mud and debris everywhere. Chloe and her family volunteered to help with the cleanup. They were assigned to an old house on the edge of town, owned by an elderly man who had been evacuated. The water line was halfway up the first floor walls. The furniture was ruined, the floors were coated in silt, and everything had that same foul, river bottom smell. Their job was to drag everything out of the house to be thrown away. It was heartbreaking work. Family photos, children's toys, a lifetime of memories, all ruined. As Chloe was hauling a waterlogged armchair out of the living room, she started to hear something. It was a low, murmuring sound, a chorus of whispers seeming to come from the walls themselves, from the mud on the floor. She couldn't make out any words, but it was undeniably the sound of human voices. She asked her dad if he heard it, but he just shook his head, blaming the acoustics of the empty, damaged house. Chloe tried to ignore it, but the murmuring continued, rising and falling in intensity. It was strongest near the fireplace. As she got closer, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the walls, but from below. The flood had washed away much of the dirt in the crawl space beneath the house, and the whispers seemed to be seeping up through the floorboards. Driven by a morbid curiosity she couldn't explain, she went outside and found the access hatch to the crawl space. It was choked with mud and debris. With her father's help, she pried it open. The smell that wafted out was horrific, far worse than the river mud. Shining a powerful flashlight inside, they saw that the flood had done more than just wash away dirt. It had eroded the earth and exposed a hidden, bricked-off section of the foundation, an old, forgotten cellar no one knew was there. And the flood had broken a hole through the top of it. The murmuring was louder now, clearly coming from that hole. Chloe's father, a practical man, called the police. He had a terrible feeling. The authorities who investigated found something that shocked the entire town. The hidden cellar was a tomb. Inside were the skeletal remains of at least 5 people. Historical records and forensic analysis eventually pieced together a grim story. 100 years prior, the house had been a stop on a lonely trade route. The family who lived there, it was believed, would rob and murder travelers, burying them in the secret cellar. They eventually vanished themselves, and the story became a forgotten, dark footnote in the town's history. The house was sold, new families moved in, and no one ever knew what lay beneath their feet. Until the great spring flood of Chloe's 16th year. The water didn't just damage the house, it washed away the earth that held its secret. Chloe believes the murmuring she heard was the collective voice of the victims, their story finally unearthed by the violent rebirth of the river. The event was a stark lesson that a natural disaster can sometimes lead to the discovery of a long, unsolved, unexplained disappearance, or in this case, several of them. The river had held its memory for a century, waiting for the right spring to finally tell its tale. Story 3. The Gardener's Gift. Our final story takes us from the wild woods and the raging river to a place that should be the epitome of spring tranquility, a suburban garden. It serves as a chilling reminder that horror doesn't always come with a loud noise or a sudden scare. Sometimes it grows quietly, beautifully, right in front of you. This account was pieced together from the journals of a woman named Evelyn and the later testimony of her concerned neighbor, David. Evelyn was a woman in her 60s who lived alone. Her pride and joy was her immaculate garden. Every spring, she would spend her days planting, weeding, and cultivating the most beautiful flower beds on the block. David, who lived next door, often admired her work. One April, David noticed a new plant in Evelyn's garden. It was striking. It had deep, velvety purple leaves and a single, large, bell-shaped flower that was the color of a pale sunset. He'd never seen anything like it. When he asked Evelyn about it, she just smiled mysteriously and said it was a gift. She couldn't remember who gave it to her or where it came from. It had simply appeared in a pot on her doorstep one morning. The plant grew at an astonishing rate. Within 2 weeks, it was the centerpiece of her garden, and it began to change things. First, the bees. David noticed that the bees, which normally flitted between all the flowers, now swarmed exclusively around the strange new plant, ignoring all others. Then, the birds stopped singing in the tree that overhung Evelyn's garden. The neighborhood cats, who used to lounge on her lawn, now gave her yard a wide berth. But the most significant change was in Evelyn herself. She became devoted to the plant. She spent all her time with it, from sunup to sundown. She would sit in a chair beside it for hours, just staring at it, a serene, vacant smile on her face. She stopped inviting friends over. She stopped answering her phone. Her other, once beloved flowers began to wither from neglect, but she didn't seem to care. All that mattered was the purple-leafed plant. David grew worried. Evelyn was getting thinner, paler. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality, but she insisted she had never felt better, never felt more at peace. One evening, David was working in his own yard when a strange, sweet scent wafted over the fence. It was coming from the flower. It was intoxicating, cloying. He felt a wave of dizziness, and for a moment, an overwhelming sense of calm washed over him. All his worries seemed to melt away. All he wanted to do was go sit by that beautiful plant. He shook his head, fighting the feeling, and a jolt of pure fear shot through him. Something was terribly wrong. He called Evelyn's estranged son, who lived several states away. Alarmed by what David told him, the son promised to drive down that weekend. But he was too late. When he arrived on Saturday morning, his mother's house was unlocked and empty. In the backyard, he found her garden chair sitting next to the giant, flourishing plant. On the chair was her gardening hat and a folded note. The note simply said, "I have to feed the roots. It's my turn to be a gift." Evelyn was never seen again. When police investigated, they were baffled. They couldn't identify the plant. When a botanist was brought in, he was disturbed. He said it had characteristics of several known parasitic and carnivorous species, but it was like nothing he had ever encountered. Under forensic lights, they found that the soil around the plant's base was heavily saturated with human blood. The official story was that Evelyn, suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness, had wandered off, another tragic case of an unexplained disappearance. But David knows what he saw. He believes the plant was a predator of a kind we don't understand, that it lured Evelyn in with a chemical or psychic hold, slowly drained her of her life and vitality, and then, in one final act of devotion, convinced her to give it the last thing she had. He sold his house and moved away that summer. He said he couldn't stand the thought of what might be blooming in his neighbor's yard the following spring. From a doll in the thawing woods, to voices in the flood, to a flower that feeds on more than just sunlight. These true spring horror stories show us that darkness can be found in the most unexpected of seasons. The world is old, and it holds countless secrets. Spring, in its rush to bring forth new life, sometimes unearths ancient horrors that were meant to stay buried forever. So, the next time you're enjoying a warm spring day, when you smell the damp earth or see the first flowers pushing through the soil, maybe take a second look. Listen a little closer. You never know what might be waking up along with the rest of the world. Thank you for joining me in the shadows tonight. If you found these stories as chilling as I did, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more explorations into the unknown. It helps the channel immensely and ensures you won't miss our next descent into darkness. Stay safe and be careful what you dig up.